Hello and welcome to UnHerd Ideas. I'm Freddie Sayers. I'm here with David Fuller, founder of Rebel Wisdom, which is one of our favourite YouTube channels, which sadly is coming to the end of its life, but you are continuing to explore the world of heterodox ideas.
Mm-hmm.
You have been much talked about in the past week because you came out with a long article about Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
This is someone who you could almost say was intimately involved with the rise of Rebel Wisdom. You did some early interviews with him, and many of your fans came from his kind of world in 2017, 2018. And you've broken with him, basically. You wrote how you're no longer a fan, or you no longer think that he is a positive contribution to the public debate. Tell us what your argument is.
So, as you say, I first discovered Jordan Peterson in about 2017. I was hugely taken with his thought, and still think that what he's saying about mythology, the Bible series, the Maps of Meaning lectures are really quite extraordinary contributions, and I really value that. And when Rebel Wisdom started, we were talking a lot about kind of the spiritual depth of his work, the religious depth of his work, more than the culture war side. And there were always multiple Jordan Petersons. There was the kind of culture warrior, obviously how he became famous through Bill C-16, but there was also a lot of people who came for the controversy, found this incredible depth of thought, and he was incredibly influential, probably became the world's most famous public intellectual in the last 5 years. And I've described him as like the one-man lightning rod for the culture war. So an incredibly significant figure and significant story to understand. And as I said, there were multiple Jordan Petersons, and we were really looking mostly at the kind of deeper mythology, the deeper trends of his thoughts and what he was bringing into the culture, which I still think, as I said, is hugely valuable. And so our audience was really tracking that kind of that side of the Jordan Peterson. And what I felt has happened over the last 5 years, and completely understandably in a way, given there are a lot of unfair attacks on him, he was misrepresented a lot by the media in 2017, 2018, and in a way was a kind of filter for free thinkers back then. A lot of the people who found their way to Rebel Wisdom, part of our community, I found they weren't the typical young lost man, as the kind of media kind of narrative would say it. There were a lot of people from all different backgrounds. So he was a filter for free thinkers. But what I'd seen over the last 5 years, and again, it's completely understandable given his health issues, given what's happened to him and many of the unfair attacks, he's become more and more of a polarizing figure. And I argue in the piece that I released that he now resembles the caricature that the worst of the media portrayals made him out to be.
What is that? What is that caricature that formerly you would have defended him from and now you think is accurate?
He now looks to me like the angry right-winger just stoking one side of the culture war without the nuance that I felt he was bringing before. He used to talk about the value of the left and the value of the right, and there was this sense of him, I felt he was trying to synthesize. He was bringing this Jungian frame which understands that each kind of archetype has a positive side and a negative side. And there was really deep, nuanced arguments about how each side needs each other. And over time, what I've found is that he's steered more and more into tickling the funny bone of the right only, and much less of a synthesizing figure. And that's not just my view. I've also, because of the shared history with Jordan Peterson and the documentaries that I put out about him, I've also been part of a lot of the Facebook groups that were set up around his thought, tracking the Reddit threads, and there's been a real shift in his audience. So that was partly what I was saying, is that there seems to have been a split between the people who are really still into him because of the culture war and just want to see him kind of bashing the left, and the people who were into him for the deeper kind of mythology, the philosophical side of his thought. And many of them have been repelled by a lot of the more recent content that seems much more angry, much less attempt to kind of to steer a path in the culture war.
So you're disappointed by this. You would have hoped that he would have stayed above the frame or not picked a side in this way. It's a charge that he should answer in some way.
He clearly picked a side, and he clearly believes that he's right to have picked a side. He clearly believes that the situation is bad enough that he should pick a side and needs to pick a side. And I can understand why he sees it that way. A lot of other people see it that way as well. But the problem is in picking a side and being so vitriolic. And I'd advise people to go and have a look at the piece that he released after his Twitter ban, which was quite really, really off-putting. The way he was talking about Elliot Page.
Okay, so let's actually look at the evidence. So first of all, he tweeted something that has led to him being banned or suspended unless he deletes the tweet. Let's have a look at it. So he says, "Remember when pride was a sin? And Ellen Page just had her breasts removed by a criminal physician." And then he quote tweets a New York Post article about Elliot Page, which is the new name of the actor who stars in Umbrella Academy and is now a man. What's your take on this message?
Yeah, so this was kind of the inciting incident for him being suspended from Twitter. I want to make the point that this was sort of the culmination of quite a lot of tweets, including one an overweight swimwear model, but this was the one that did get him suspended. After this, he then released a long piece on his YouTube channel about this that I would call more of a rant.
Got a little excerpt of it here.
And I'm not taking down that tweet or acknowledging that my tweet violated the Twitter rules. Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
So here, the first thing that strikes you is the kind of setting. He's now got this very quite well-produced, well-lit black background with a kind of halo light effect, pinstripe sort of mobster suit, mysterious button that hopefully one of the commenters will tell us what it stands for. And then he's angry. Is that what you're noticing? He's quite fierce.
Yeah, I mean, I think the aesthetics are interesting, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I'm more interested in the tone of his discussion of Elliot, Ellen Page. The entire, and I wonder about playing that clip. And he talked about he defended the criminal physician's statement by saying, well, the Nazi doctors, were they criminal or not? Like that kind of language, I just think that's going to appeal to people who are already on his side of the aisle. It's not going to persuade anyone who is not already bought into his argument already. And I don't understand how someone who's a clinical psychologist doesn't have I don't know how you can have this conversation without having some empathy for people who are going through gender dysphoria. Like, if you're only going to take a fully combative attitude to this, one of the most difficult topics to talk about in the culture right now, I just don't see how you're going to be able to do that without some nuance, without some compassion, unless you're only trying to appeal to one side of the culture war. It's a very delicate argument to have, and I think, ironically, it's an argument that is starting to be won. As a journalist as well, like even the New York Times just recently, a couple of weeks ago, had an article by I think Emily Bazelon that was the first time that you'd seen the New York Times, which previously had a really blanket kind of ideological position of trans women are women and that's all there is to say. They had this long article that I think was 8 months in the making that finally kind of conceded a lot of the questions that people have been raising for a long time about the ideology, and things are starting to shift. And that's, I think, how things shift in the culture, not through just simply stoking one side of the culture war. And I think Peterson at his best, and Peterson 5 years ago would have been more interested in that sort of synthesis or that kind of nuanced argument. And increasingly now, I just see him not being interested in the nuanced argument at all, just kind of tickling the funny bone of one side of the culture war. And I don't believe he used to be like that. And I don't believe that's his fundamental orientation. But I do think, and this is what I'd love to come to later in the conversation, is the impact of social media and audience capture and all of these dynamics that warp us and make us into more extreme versions of ourselves, which is what we've seen with so many public intellectuals, not just Jordan Peterson, over the last 5 years or so. Like, this is something I think so many people from, without naming any names.
Well, let's name some.
Russell,
who else?
Russell Brand. Russell Brand now, if you look at his YouTube channel, it's very clickbaity titles. It's very following the YouTube audience. It's much more conspiratorial. It's much more it's perfectly calibrated for a YouTube audience. The nature of audience capture, particularly on YouTube, is that you end up giving the audience what they need. You've got a comments thread that creates the echo chambers, creates the filter bubbles, and I think it has a warping effect on creators. I know this myself, maybe you do as well, as having a YouTube channel on the UnHerd YouTube channel. It starts to warp, and I feel it in myself. Like there are certain topics that I know that I'm wary about talking about, or talking about in a particular way, or self-censoring, and feeling kind of dragged more and more towards what the audience wants, and the difficulty in calibrating. I don't think people recognize, I think people realize now with films like The Social Dilemma, how toxic social media can be, how it brings out the worst in us, our narcissism, our tribalism, all of these issues, because it encourages us to keep coming back if we're involved in an argument, and it polarizes and splits society. I don't think people yet realize how impactful that is on creators, on people who are, and now because the institutions are increasingly failing, more and more people are getting their news, their opinions, their information from individuals rather than institutions. So the characteristics of those individuals, the psychological flaws of those individuals, the way they communicate, what they say, what they don't say, all of that suddenly is relevant. And so we're in a world where suddenly we're in a world of sort of shifting sands, and also where we're increasingly seeing a kind of polarizing effect of the audience that makes people into more and more extreme versions of themselves. And I would say that's what I think has happened to Jordan Peterson, is that he was holding out this more synthesis perspective 5 years ago, and has just steered more and more into what more of the audience wanted, which was just being a culture warrior. Just being a culture warrior, not attempting to kind of, not attempting to communicate beyond his own side.
Would he not say, and I should say we have asked him to be here and discuss this with us, and hopefully he will, would he not say it's not culture warrior or audience capture so much as just realizing what his position is? From an initial kind of agnostic searching role, he increasingly maybe has felt confident what he believes to be closest to the truth, and therefore thinks it's virtuous and necessary to fight that battle.
Yeah.
I mean, what's wrong with that, if that's what he would say?
Yeah, and I imagine he would also say, you don't realize things are really much more urgent than they were 5 years ago, and that's why I'm responding to it. Don't you realize what's going on in Canada now with the creeping authoritarianism, all of these issues? And of course, there's going to be different views on this depending on where you are. I'm based in the UK. I've got a different experience than he does being in Canada. But I just don't see how you're going to, even if you believe that these are the most important issues in the world, I don't know how you think you're going to persuade anyone without, with basically yelling at them. Like, how has that ever worked in an argument when you're talking to someone, when you're not trying to kind of at least understand where they're coming from, argue in a way where you can find some common ground? This is, I just don't see, even if you think this is the most important issue in the world, I don't think bringing that into your delivery and intensely kind of yelling at people is the way to do it. And I think back in the day, before he was consumed by this culture war dynamic, and again, like, I have huge empathy for and admiration for Jordan Peterson for what he brought back in 2017. And I understand, I mean, he, as I said, the one-man lightning rod for the culture war, you can't go through what he's gone through without having some effect. So it feels uncomfortable talking about him because he's a real person. I've only met him twice. I was in contact because of the two documentaries that I did, and the amazing coincidence that he was on Channel 4 News, where I used to work for 10 years, and then rose to fame with the interview with Kathy Newman. So there's kind of a real shared history. And I feel uncomfortable talking about him because he's a person. He's a person I've met. He's a person everyone has sympathy for because he's been so open about his struggles and his story, and that's part of what people identify with it, is that he's a real person.
He's falling short, you feel like? It's fair to say.
It's not for me to judge whether he's falling short. All I can say is, like, my experience and what I've seen with the different groups of people who've been tracking his trajectory, I would say the universal response to the article that I put out from the people that I respect, recognize, and have connected with over the trajectory of Jordan Peterson has been, thank you for saying this. No one's saying it because he's now such a kingmaker, because he's now got this so much power, because the nature of the alternative media is this kind of invisible hierarchy of status where people are hopeful that they might get him on their podcast or they'll be on his podcast. People don't, the alternative media, people don't speak out. There's so many corrupting factors in the alternative media. There's so many corrupting factors in the mainstream media as well. Like, this is one of the reasons that Jordan Peterson has been successful, Rebel Wisdom's been successful, UnHerd has been successful, is that the media became corrupt and became a kind of parody of truth-seeking, but there's real problems in the alternative as well.
Well, I want to come on to the whole question of the alternative media and whether that can be fixed. But just to finish on Jordan Peterson, we actually had Dave Rubin on this show, and I was asking very similar questions to what you're saying. I said, well, you used to be this sort of open-minded, intellectual, dark web character, and now I think he would and did openly say he's very much a conservative. He has a very clear view of the world, and he's fighting to win. And he said that. He said basically that he's given up on the existing institutions as being fair arbiters for these sort of struggles. And he thinks whole new institutions need to be created. And there reaches a point, and I think maybe Jordan Peterson has got to a similar place, where it becomes about winning. And they think that the contribution they can make is bigger and more impactful to be fighters on one side. I mean, I guess I have to ask, what's wrong with that? Maybe that is true. Maybe it might, you might be sad because the kind of, lofty, sort of liberal-minded character is no more, but maybe he is more useful to the world as a combative member of one side.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I understand why. I mean, Dave Rubin is another good example. But Dave Rubin, as far as I can tell, has kind of vanished from the conversation by picking a side. I don't see him being particularly influential anymore. He's just talking to a very small echo chamber of people on his side of the aisle. I don't see, like, Dave Rubin, where is he now? Like, he's not part of the conversation. Jordan Peterson was. And I understand why if that's where Jordan Peterson has ended up. I've not heard him say that explicitly. For a long time back in 2017, 2018, he was being framed as being a right-winger, and he would say, I'm not a right-winger. He's on record as saying, I'm being framed as a right-winger, and I'm not. I'm genuinely trying to express things that are not part of the conversation. If he has decided, right, there's all that we can do now is fight, I don't think that works. I don't think that's how you persuade people. I guess I still have a faith that that there is still an opportunity for dialogue, and I don't see that happening.
So I wonder whether this is actually a symptom of, as you call them, incentive structures, audience capture, features of the new media ecosystem, social media, feedback loops, etc., or whether it's just a human reality. And maybe it was always like that. We are built to form groups. In fact, I'm sure Jordan Peterson would agree with that. And it's very deep in our way of thinking. And that's how we're at our best in some ways. You need to be surrounded by people who, to some degree, reflect back what you think, and that you can kind of grow together with some kind of coherence. And you form tribes, you form groups of thinkers or warriors or whatever they are. And that's how human beings have always progressed. So maybe the kind of liberal or the person who floats above it trying to understand all sides is actually quite an unnatural, hard position to sustain for very long because it's quite inhuman. And eventually it becomes too exhausting and you feel like there's something more flowing and profound about sort of picking a team. Maybe it's not social media. Maybe it's just human beings.
But I would say the two things are not mutually exclusive. It is human beings. It is psychology. The nature of social media is that Silicon Valley has got these incredibly sophisticated tools to mine our psychology and to prey on our tribalism, to magnify our tribalism. The issue is that we are effective in groups of mixed temperament and mixed ability. that's the idea. Tribalism is actually an existential threat because it's splitting us off into camps of different perspectives rather than allowing us to come together. That's why we have the different temperaments, which is again something in a way I took from Jordan Peterson, was that by those different temperaments, those different abilities, on the left to be more open, on the conservative side to be more disciplined, more conscientious, we have to come together in groups of these mixed temperaments. What we're seeing is increased polarization, increased fragmentation by social media mining our innate biases and fragmenting us off into groups where I think we become ineffective. And society itself, I think, is breaking down, particularly in America. I think we're in a different position here in the UK, and I have more hope. I think there is a civil space in the UK outside the culture war, outside the sense of politicization and fragmentation. In America, I don't think there is. I think America is in a very dark place. And I just see stuff like this as adding to it, as fueling it. And I don't see the kind of... Peterson used to talk a lot about like the danger of dehumanizing language, the danger of these unexamined kind of disgust. And yet I'm picking up a huge amount of disgust, a huge amount of borderline dehumanizing language in a lot of what he's putting out at the moment. And I don't see, he has said before, I don't know how you resolve those kind of divisions in anything short of conflict. And I think he's fueling one side of the conflict. I think that's effectively, if he's decided that's what needs to happen, he's decided that actually he and Dave Rubin decided that what's required is actually a civil war, or actually or just to win the culture war.
Isn't politics sort of agonistic or combative by nature? And ultimately, one group needs to win the argument. The idea that everything is always a compromise between all groups thinking differently has never really been true. Maybe that's what they're doing. They plan to win. They don't plan to persuade. They plan to win. I can't speak for them, but is that a frightening thought, do you think?
Again, it's understandable, and everything that I'm seeing and you're saying looks like that's the decision that he's made. It's a decision I'm disappointed that he's made, and one that I think a lot of the people that a lot of the people who've been following him and I've been tracking in these various groups, I think, thought that he was up to something different. They thought he wasn't just a culture warrior. If that's the role that he's now fully embraced, then that is, I do find that disappointing.
Let's talk about the alternative media or heterodox media. You're shutting down Rebel Wisdom. Is that in some way an expression of disappointment at the state of alternative media? I mean, what should we be doing that we're not?
It's not solely because of that. It's partly because I feel like the narrative arc that I was following on the media channel with Rebel Wisdom is complete. I don't really know where to go. I've got quite a few things that I'm putting out between now and the end of the project in November, but I feel like the narrative arc that I was tracking around things like existential risk, personal growth, and kind of heterodox thought is complete. And also I do feel like the heterodox space itself became very warped, especially during COVID. I've talked about the alternative media, this kind of concept of the uncanny valley between the mainstream and the alternative. We've got a mainstream that is not open to enough voices. It's trying to gatekeep the conversation, and it doesn't include enough voices. And then you've got the alternative, which will platform a lot of those alternative voices, but there's no incentive to challenge them. So particularly during COVID, you had, because a lot of this became very heated, very weaponized, because the information landscape or information around COVID had huge health implications. The mainstream not including enough perspectives, as you know from some of the problems that you had with UnHerd, but the alternative rarely had any incentive to challenge the people that they were bringing on. Controversial figures like Robert Malone, I've never seen him in conversation with a medical figure who's equipped to challenge his perspective. Other kind of people who became very, very prominent, very successful because of the narrative that they were kind of pushing.
Who are you thinking about?
Robert Malone, Peter McCullough, some of the figures who... There was a whole controversy over Joe Rogan when Joe Rogan hosted those voices. And it ended up being an attempt to kind of cancel Joe Rogan, and there was the whole kind of racism thing, which I think was very cynical. But that simple fact of Joe Rogan hosting these voices, he's not equipped to challenge them. But then who is equipped to challenge them? Where is a place that's equipped to kind of I don't think it's enough just to host these voices and not take any responsibility for the information that they're putting out. So I think there has to be some, we talked about kind of the lack of institutions, there has to be some kind of new institutions where we are challenging some of these voices. At the moment, the mainstream's just saying, we're not going to touch this. But once people get to a certain level of prominence, I think there has to be a need to kind of interrogate the truth of their claims. And I don't see anywhere that's trying to do that. Not in the alternative, not in the mainstream, and I don't see.
I mean, not to, blow UnHerd's trumpet here, but we definitely have been trying. Yeah. I mean, there is an editorial judgment you need to make on who you're going to invite onto your show, definitely.
Yeah.
And there were lots of people suggested we should have on during COVID, and we didn't. And some of those people have become very prominent since, and you make a judgment at the time.
Yeah.
I feel ultimately that the audience trusts the host or the editor to make those decisions, and they might be wrong, they might be right. But if someone else, like Joe Rogan or Brett Weinstein or anyone else, comes to a different view, I'm happy to disagree with it, but I don't think ban it. I wouldn't,
no.
And I wouldn't necessarily even judge them too harshly for having come to a different point of view. I think that's the whole idea, that you should be allowed different people's judgment, and audience will flow to whoever they think ultimately comes closest to the truth.
Yeah, I'm more concerned with whether people are, for example, if you're hosting people from both sides of the argument. You mentioned Brett Weinstein. I had a quite difficult experience because Brett was a friend, and I disagreed mainly with the fact that he wouldn't host anyone from the counterpoint. He was hosting people like Robert Malone. He was asking questions about ivermectin and making very strong statements about ivermectin, like it was a 100% effective prophylactic against COVID. At very important times during the pandemic, he went on Joe Rogan with Pierre Corey, and they made a lot of statements about the effectiveness of ivermectin that I think have proven not to be the case. Now people are saying, well, maybe it has a small effect here or there, and there's an argument.
He would take it. If he was here, which he was recently, he'd probably...
Would he still say it was 100% effective at preventing COVID?
You would have to
I
ask
doubt
him.
it.
Yeah.
But he has not still, to this day, hosted anyone on his program. A medical voice is equipped to challenge his claims around ivermectin or vaccines. I don't think, for me, that's not ethical truth-seeking. And I know Joe Rogan wrestles with that and does try to have people from both sides to a greater degree. But yeah, I mean, and people will make their judgments over the actions of the people who are making the decisions in the alternative media space. But what I'm pointing at is there's no incentive for anyone in the alternative media space to host people from the other side. Their audience don't like it. There's no reason to ask them difficult questions. That means they might not come back on. You've got all of these kind of warping effects of the alternative media.
I'm thinking through what you're saying, and I know exactly what you mean, and I understand the attraction of this kind of impartial figure or someone who is constantly open to the other side. I suppose in reality, I'm not sure it's about the corruption or audience capture so much, but people do become known for more one side than the other. And at that point, perhaps they feel that their contribution is to correct the overall discussion space by bringing a particular point of view to the table. If, for example, the mainstream media, every BBC, CNBC, any channel in the US are showing the same experts time and time again, and they're just everywhere, what is the merit of bringing those people on they probably won't come anyway. And if they do, you're then going to have some sort of discussion with them that might not go that well. Is that a realistic thing to ask, I wonder, of a kind of alternative media space, that they present themselves BBC-like, or, you know, in some kind of theoretical impartiality, which of course is never possible anyway? Or maybe it's just more realistic to say, and as I keep saying, more human, to say that as long as people are kind of transparent about their vantage point, that's actually a more real way to conduct a public conversation, where guests, hosts, editors are all known to come from somewhere, because everyone has a view. We know that from every BBC journalist. We see it on their Twitter profile, what they really think half the time. And maybe that's a more honest way to have the discussion than this pretense at impartiality. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's true that the mainstream was always a pretense at impartiality. I think the rise of the alternative media has kind of shown up that the kind of view from nowhere affectation of the mainstream was always an affectation. I think that's really healthy. It's kind of shown up that there was people talk about the MSM, which I think is an oversimplification, but there's some truth in it. That there was a kind of narrowness of the conversation. The fact that the alternative media has kind of expanded the types of views and types of perspectives you can find is fantastic. But what I fear is that we're all just getting siloed more and more in bubbles of mutual incomprehension. And that has an effect on the creators. The creators, I think, get trapped in a particular perspective, and they then start not seeking to grow, to learn, to kind of improve their understanding, and then improving the understanding of the people who are following them. I feel that we're just trapped in kind of ever decreasing circles, because that's what the audience wants, that's what the algorithms reward. And I think ultimately that's a really dangerous thing, because if you don't have, we're literally in a situation now where we don't understand each other. We don't even understand how people can think the way that they think. We're in mutual incomprehension, and I don't see how a society survives with this level of fragmentation, this level of mutual incomprehension. And I think it's worse. As I said, I think it's probably worse in America. My experience is that the conversation's so much more polarized and more fragmented there than it is here. But I see it as a fundamental problem, because how do you have collective action to solve? We've got huge problems as a society, as a culture. And if we can't come to any agreement on what those problems are, and we can't even have discussions with each other about what those problems are, I think that's a really, really dangerous thing for the future of any kind of common purpose, whether that's democracy or post-liberal or whatever. I think that deep fragmentation into kind of echo chambers and, as I said, mutual incomprehension is a civilisational threat. And there's stuff we've got to look at, there's stuff we've got to kind of to do and to tackle.
Do you think, if we're really going to zoom out and go big picture, do you think it is a sign of a kind of major global civilizational decline in some way? Do you think you and I are living on the kind of downslope of civilization? If it goes in waves, we're on a receding one. Do you think that's the truth?
I've spent the last 5 years with Rebel Wisdom sort of tracking some of the most interesting, intelligent thinkers around, people like Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jamie Wheel, and universally, they are talking about very, very serious problems. Kind of existential risk dynamics, and they can list like 12 different existential risks that are really pressing and we don't know how to deal with. So yes, I think that everything that I've been tracking suggests that we are in kind of post-liberal times, and probably in the kind of things are getting serious at the very least.
So do you think there's anything that
I think part of it is this exponential tech. I think exponential tech is at the core of this. Daniel Schmachtenberger, who I mentioned before, talks about the generator functions, and it's partly the game theory, the drivers, the generator functions that are driving tech. The fact that there's a race to the bottom of the brainstem in tech, that it's trying to kind of trigger us, the fact that it's kind of they're all in a fight with each other to kind of maximize attention, which means that they end up polarizing. They're preying on the worst aspects of our personalities. So in a way, I feel like we've exploited the world as much as we can. Now we're kind of exploiting the inner world as much as we can. And there's a kind of, so in a way, like our own psychology has been weaponized against us by the tech platforms, and all of our kind of most destructive patterns, narcissism, kind of tribalism, is being exploited and exacerbated by all of this. Jonathan Haidt had a beautiful explanation in a conversation with Sam Harris. Jonathan Haidt, the author of The Righteous Mind, said, imagine that you change the law of gravity. What would happen if you changed the law of gravity? You'd find planes falling out of the sky. So many things would change downstream from that, and you'd be in a completely different world. He says we did something in around 2013, 2014 with social media that effectively changed the gravity of our social interactions. The nature of social media changed the gravity, changed how salient or important it all felt, changed how intense everything was in the feedback that we're getting from our phones. So it changed the nature of the conversation in the social realm. So everything feels much more intense all the time. And that has had huge effects downstream. The availability of that information and the fact that it's preying on our kind of worst aspects. And yeah, so I do think that that's an existential danger, but it's not the only one.
Let me try and make an alternative diagnosis, which I might or might not manage to do. A lot of what you're saying, and thinkers like Jonathan Haidt do the same, wraps up these changes together with social media and new technology, and it's all a very new, very contemporary phenomenon. I think what you're talking about, which I agree with, is that there's an actual fragmentation of epistemology, of theory of knowledge, so that people are moving into camps that are so far removed from each other they can't even agree on the terms of discussion. So there is no chance of compromise. And I think that is happening. But maybe that is the normal state of affairs. If we were living in ancient Greece, where we may or may not have joined the Trojan army or been part of Achilles' troop or Agamemnon's troop or whatever, there was no unified liberal set of principles that we should be striving to. There were different tribes and different groups trying to win. And that's basically been human history until about 300 years ago with the Enlightenment. And since then, there's been this sense of, hey, we can all be one world with a single set of principles and a single theory of knowledge. Perhaps that was the anomaly, and that was the innovation. And maybe that's just not a sustainable set of affairs. Maybe we are going to return to a kind of post-Enlightenment zone where maybe people feel more comfortable, not feeling that they all have to sign up to a single set of principles, a single version of science, an official version of what is true and what isn't true. Maybe people prefer to be able to pick their team, pick their religion, and live in a world that they feel comfortable with, even if it's very different and possibly, at odds with other groups. Do you think that might be true? Do you think there may be a kind of positive aspect in some way to this destruction? Maybe the world we're moving into isn't so much a new dystopia created by technology. Maybe it's just a more normal human world that actually people are going to feel more human in.
Not sure I understand your analogy, because like 300 years ago, we still had the nation state, and nation states were going to war, still do go to war. So it's not like that we had one society that was all kind of united around a set of common values. It was very different values in the different countries. So in a way, are you talking about kind of the end of the nation state, or?
I'm talking about the invention since the Western powers colonized the rest of the world, since the Enlightenment philosophers gave this idea of a kind of certain truth that could be accessed through the scientific method. All of the foundation underpinnings of the modern world, the globalized world, the secular world. And it does feel like that was very much a period. It was a phase that had its high points maybe in the second half of the 20th century. And now, both in a geopolitical sense, that's clearly breaking up into smaller worlds, but also philosophically, even within countries such as the US, like you talk about, people no longer agree on the terms of play. And I just wonder whether there's any optimism in that, or whether it's just a bleak disintegration into some kind of dark times. Can you join me in trying to find some positivity here?
Yeah, I definitely agree. We're at the end. We're kind of clearly, everyone senses we're at the end of a worldview. We're at the end of a kind of way of understanding the world, a way of being in the world. I definitely think we're also in post-secular times, and that was one of the reasons I was really drawn to Jordan Peterson, was that I felt he was articulating the religion in a way, in a kind of very secular world, in a way that felt defendable, felt kind of like was able to go toe-to-toe with the new atheists. So I do think we're in sort of post-secular times, and in a way we're seeing religions, or the religious fervor, going into different areas. Like we're seeing it in politics. We're seeing kind of new religions in so many different kind of new manifestations. And also the return of the irrational, as symbolized by something like the Q shaman in the Senate, like that vision of like the irrational howling to the heathen gods in the middle of kind of the American empire, I think is, so we're definitely in a weird, new, strange world. And I think that's exciting. That feels quite exciting as someone who's always been interested in the irrational, the archetypal, the Jungian, like all of this sort of, and I do think we're in a time where we need to go through like deep, again, a Jungian frame. The collective shadows, I think, are now leaking out all around us, partly because of the alternative media. All of these people, all of these things now have a voice. So as a culture, I feel like we're going to have to do some kind of cultural shadow work or cultural processing of all of this, for sure. Whether that means that we'll split up into different groups where we feel more comfortable, and maybe that's a positive vision for the future. I think getting to that point is probably going to be quite messy. But there's a lot of people now theorizing about whether we're at the end of the nation state or not. Far smarter people than me, so I won't guess along that. But I am excited in a way, because it does feel like there's an opportunity for a new worldview now, which I think I personally find the kind of the secular, rationalist, materialist, reductionist, new atheist perspective so deadening and boring, and just not really in tune with what it means to be a human being. And so I welcome the fact that it feels that we're at the end of that. But I think we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We need to keep science. We need to keep all of the incredible systems and the incredible systems of knowledge that we've created. So it's transcending and including rather than losing all of that.
So we've painted maybe a bleak, maybe a hopeful, but certainly a picture of major change, and that we're at a very, very interesting civilisational moment. What do you think, if anything, we can do as individuals to try and improve the overall outcome or play our part in it?
I feel like the answer has to be, because we're being we talked a lot about the tech platforms and how they're kind of weaponizing our psychology against us. That's only one factor, but the world's getting more and more intense. It's getting more and more confusing, more and more overwhelming. I feel like the answer has to be to come back to to really upgrade our own capacities with mindfulness, with more practice. One of the thinkers in Jordan Peterson's department, a guy called John Vervaeke, who I'm making a documentary with at the moment, he really focuses on the nature of self-deception, how we deceive ourselves and how we're deceived by the culture, and the need for practice, for more embodiment practice. And
that means meditation and mindfulness, and those. That's what does practice mean if you don't?
Yeah, sort of different self-development techniques. This is kind of what the Rebel Wisdom Project has always been about. It's been about the ideas and the philosophies and the psychologies, but also the different practices from breath work to meditation to kind of self-reflection to journaling to all of these different
Prayer.
practices. Interesting one. We haven't worked with that, but I think prayer is a really valuable.
The OG, it's the original practice, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a psychotechnology is what John Bevacqua would call it. And what prayer does is it's an ego deflation thing. It's sort of saying rather than trying, it's admitting we don't know and looking for answers. So that humility practice is really valuable. So I think when I talked about post-secular, I feel like we need to reintegrate what was religion doing for us as a culture, and what have we lost by losing religion. And I think bringing those in a new way. So secular versions of some of the practices that religions had to allow us to kind of help ourselves individually and help ourselves socially. Though that's really the cutting edge, I think, is what goes in the hole left by religion. What were the practices that religion developed to help us thrive as individuals and as a society? How do we reintegrate those? And yeah, how do we grow to counter the way that we're being manipulated increasingly? How do we develop our own capacities individually, culturally, and as a society?
David Fuller, thank you.
Freddie, thank you.
That was David Fuller, the founder of Rebel Wisdom, which is a YouTube channel that explores some similar themes to us, but is sadly entering its final months. The conversation will, of course, carry on here at UnHerd. David was an original supporter, a big supporter of the Canadian thinker Jordan Peterson. Now, as you heard, he's not so sure whether he is for the good or not, but it feels a little bit odd to discuss someone who's not in the room. Hopefully it was a fair discussion, and if you are watching, Jordan, we would be delighted to have you on next time, and we could talk about the same things with you in person. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd Ideas.